This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Uncle Remus by Joel Chandler Harris. Volume 3, A Story of the War. When Miss Theodosia Huntington of Burlington, Vermont, concluded to come south in 1870, she was moved by three considerations. In the first place, her brother, John Huntington, had become a citizen of Georgia, having astonished his acquaintances by marrying a young lady, the male members of whose family had achieved considerable distinction in the Confederate army. In the second place, she was anxious to explore a region which she had almost unconsciously pictured to herself as remote and semi-barbarous. And in the third place, her friends had persuaded her that to some extent she was an invalid. It was in vain that she argued with herself as to the propriety of undertaking the journey alone and unprotected, and she finally put an end to inward and outward doubts by informing herself and her friends, including John Huntington, her brother, who was practicing law in Atlanta, that she had decided to visit the South. When, therefore, on the 12th of October, 1870, the date is duly recorded in one of Miss Theodosia's letters, she alighted from the cars in Atlanta in the midst of a great crowd, she fully expected to find her brother waiting to receive her. The bells of several locomotives were ringing, a number of trains were moving in and out, and the porters and baggage men were screaming and brawling to such an extent that for several moments Miss Huntington was considerably confused, so much so that she paused in the hope that her brother would suddenly appear and rescue her from the smoke and dust and din. At that moment someone touched her on the arm, and she heard a strong, half-confident, half-apologetic voice exclaim, "Ain't this yer Miss Doshy?" Turning, Miss Theodosia saw at her side a tall, gray-haired negro. Elaborating the incident afterward to her friends, she was pleased to say that the appearance of the old man was somewhat picturesque. He stood towering above her, his hat in one hand, a carriage whip in the other, and an expectant smile lighting up his rugged face. She remembered a name her brother had often used in his letters, and, with a woman's tact, she held out her hand and said, "Is this Uncle Remus?" "Law, Miss Doshy, how you know the old nigger? I knowed you by the favor, but how you know me?" And then, without waiting for a reply, "Miss Sally, she's sick in bed, and Mars John, he bleeds to go in the country, and they took and sont me. I knowed you the minute I laid eyes on you. Time I seed you, I say to myself, I laid there's Miss Doshy, and sure enough, there you was. You ain't goin' up your checks, is you? 'Cause I'll git the trunk sont up by the 'spress wagon." The next moment Uncle Remus was elbowing his way unceremoniously through the crowd, and in a very short time, seated in the carriage driven by the old man, Miss Huntington was whirling through the streets of Atlanta in the direction of her brother's home. She took advantage of the opportunity to study the old negro's face closely, her natural curiosity considerably sharpened by a knowledge of the fact that Uncle Remus had played an important part in her brother's history. The result of her observation must have been satisfactory, for presently she laughed and said, "Uncle Remus, you haven't told me how you knew me in that great crowd." The old man chuckled, and gave the horses a gentle rap with the whip. "Who, me? I knowed you by the favor. Dat boy Mars Johns is the very spittin' an image of you. I'd a knowed you in New Orleans, let alone down there in the car shed." This was Miss Theodosia's introduction to Uncle Remus. One Sunday afternoon, a few weeks after her arrival, the family were assembled in the piazza, enjoying the mild weather. Mr. Huntington was reading a newspaper. His wife was crooning softly as she rocked the baby to sleep, and the little boy was endeavoring to show his Aunt Dosia the outlines of Kennesaw Mountain through the purple haze that hung like a wonderfully fashioned curtain in the sky and almost obliterated the horizon. While they were thus engaged, Uncle Remus came round the corner of the house talking to himself. "Dey're too lazy to work," he was saying, "and dey 'spects honest folks fer to stan' up and s'port 'em. I'm gwine down to Putmon County where Mars Jeems is. Dat's w'at I'm a-gwine to do." "What's the matter now, Uncle Remus?" inquired Mr. Huntingdon, folding up his newspaper. "Nothin' 'tall, Mars John, 'ceptin' dese yer sunshine niggers. Dey begs my terbacker, and borrys my tools, and steals my vittles, and it's done come to dat pass dat I gotter pack up and go. I'm a-gwine down to Putmon, dat's w'at." Uncle Remus was accustomed to make this threat several times a day, but upon this occasion it seemed to remind Mr. Huntingdon of something. "Very well," he said, "I'll come around and help you pack up. But before you go, I want you to tell Sister here how you went to war and fought for the Union. Remus was a famous warrior," he continued, turning to Miss Theodosia. "He volunteered for one day and commanded an army of one. You know the story, but you've never heard Remus's version." Uncle Remus shuffled around in an awkward, embarrassed way, scratched his head, and looked uncomfortable. "Miss Doshy ain't got no time fer to set dar and hear the old nigger run on." "Oh, yes, I have, Uncle Remus," exclaimed the young lady. "Plenty of time." The upshot of it was that, after many ridiculous protests, Uncle Remus sat down on the steps and proceeded to tell his story of the war. Miss Theodosia listened with great interest, but throughout it all she observed, and she was painfully conscious of the fact, as she afterward admitted, that Uncle Remus spoke from the standpoint of a Southerner, and with the air of one who expected his hearers to thoroughly sympathize with him. "Course," said Uncle Remus, addressing himself to Miss Theodosia, "you ain't been to Putmon, and you dunno where the Brad slaughter place and Harmony Grove is, but Mars John and Miss Sally, dey been dere a time or two, and dey knows how de land lays. Well, den, it was right long in dere where Mars Jeems lived, and where he live now. When de war come along, he was livin' dere longer ole Miss and Miss Sally. Ole Miss was his ma, and Miss Sally dere was his sister. De war come des like I tell you, and marters sorter rock along same as dey allers did. It didn't strike me dat dey was any war goin' on, but ef I hadn't sorter missed de neighbors, and seed folks gwine outen de way fer to ax de news, I'd 'lowed to myself dat de war was way off 'mong some yuther country. But all dis time de fuss was gwine on, and Mars Jeems, he was des itchin' for to put in. Ole Miss and Miss Sally, dey took on so he didn't git off de fus year, but bimeby news come down dat times was gittin' putty hot, and Mars Jeems he got up, he did, and say he gotter go, and go he did. He got a overseer fer to look after de place, and he went and jined de army. And he 'uz a fighter, too, Mars Jeems was. Many's and many's de time," continued the old man reflectively, "dat I had to take and bresh dat boy on account of his 'busin' and beatin' dem yuther boys. He went off dere fer to fight, and he fit. Ole Miss used to call me up Sunday and read what the papers say 'bout Mars Jeems, and it hope her up mightily. I can see it jest like it was yesterday. 'Remus,' says she, 'dish yer's what the papers say 'bout my baby,' and den she read out twel she couldn't read fer cryin'. Hit went on dis way year in and year out, and dem was lonesome times, sho's you're born, Miss Doshy, lonesome times sho. Hit got hotter and hotter in de war, and lonesomer and mo' lonesomer at home, and bimeby 'long come de conscription man, and he jest everlastingly scoop up Mars Jeems' overseer. When dis come about, ole Miss, she sot after me and says she, 'Remus, I ain't got nobody fer to look after de place but you,' says she, and den I up and say, says I, 'Mistus, you kin jest pen on de ole nigger.' I was old den, Miss Doshy, let 'lone what I is now, and you better believe I bossed dem hands. I had dem niggers up in de field long 'fore day, and de way dey did work was a caution. If dey didn't earn der vittles dat season, den I ain't named Remus. But dey was tuck keer on. Dey had plenty er clothes, plenty er grub, and dey was de fattest niggers in de settlement. Bimeby, one day, ole Miss, she call me up and say de Yankees done gone and tuck Atlanty, dish yer very town. Den presently I hear dey was a marchin' on down towards Putman. And lo and beholds, one day, the first news I knowed, Mars Jeems, he rid up with a whole gang of men. He just stopped long enough for to change hosses and snatch a muffle of something to eat, but 'fore he rid off, he call up and say, says he, "Daddy," all old Mrs. Chillin's call me Daddy. "Daddy," he say, "'pears like dere's gwineter be mighty rough times round here. De Yankees, dey er done got to Madison and Monticello, and 'twon't be many days 'fore dey get down here. 'Tain't likely dey'll pester mudder nor sister, but, Daddy, if de wust come to de wust, I spec you to take keer of 'em," says he. Den I say, says I, "How long you been knowin' me, Mars Jeems?" says I. "Since I was a baby," says he. "Well, den, Mars Jeems," says I, "you know 'twa'n't no use fer to ax me to take keer of ole Miss and Miss Sally." Den he tuck and squoze my hand, and jump on de filly I been savin' fer him, and rid off. One time he turn around, look like he want to say somethin', but he just wave his hand, so he gallop on. I knowed den de trouble was brewin'. Nigger dat knows he's gwineter git thumped can sorter fix hisse'f, and I tuck and fix up like de war was gwineter come right in at de front gate. I took and got all de cattle and hosses together, and driv 'em to de 4-mile place. And I took all de corn and fodder and wheat, and put 'em in a crib out there in de woods. And I built me a pen in de swamp, and there I put de hogs. Den, when I fix all dis, I put on my Sunday clothes and ground my axe. 2 whole days I ground dat axe. De grindstone was inside of de gate and close to de big house, and there I took my stand. By one day, here come de Yankees. 2 of 'em come fuss, and den de whole face of de earth swam with 'em. De first glimpse I cotch of 'em, I took my axe and march into ole Miss' settin' room. She done had de sideboard moved in there, and I wish I may drap if it weren't fairly blazin' with silver. Silver cups and silver saucers, silver plates and silver dishes, silver mugs and silver pitchers. Looked like to me dey was fixin' fer a weddin'. There sot ole Miss jest as prim and as proud as if she owned a whole county. Dis kinder hope me up, 'cause I done seed ole Miss look dat-a-way once before when de overseer struck me in de face wid a whip. I sot down by de fire wid my axe 'tween my knees. There we sot whiles de Yankees ransacked de place. Miss Sally there, she got sorter restless, but ole Miss don't scarcely bat her eyes. By we hear steps on de piazza, and here come a couple of young fellers with strops on their shoulders, and the swords a draggin' on the floor, and the spurs a rattlin'. I won't say I was skeered, said Uncle Remus, as though endeavoring to recall something he failed to remember. I won't say I was skeered, 'cause I wasn't, but I was took wid a mighty funny feelin' in the neighborhood of my gizzard. They was mighty perlite, dem young chaps was, but ole Miss, she never turned her head, and Miss Sally, she looked straight at the fire. By one of 'em see me, and he say, says he, "Hello, old man, what you doin' in here?" says he. "Well, boss," says I been cuttin' some wood for ole Miss, and I just stopped for to warm my hands a little," says I. "It is cold, that's a fact," says he. With dat, I got up and took my stand behind Ole Miss and Miss Sally, and de man what speak, he went up and warm his hands. Fust thing you know, he raise up sudden and says he, "What dat on yo' axe?" "Dat's de fire shinin' on it," says I. "Hit look like blood," says he, and then he laughed. But bless your soul, dat man wouldn't laugh dat day if he'd knowed de workin's of Remus's mind. But dey didn't bother nobody nor touch nothin', and bimeby dey all put out. Well, de Yankees dey kep' passin' all de mornin', and it looked like to me dey was a string of 'em 10 mile long. Den dey commenced gettin' thinner and thinner, and then after a while we hear skirmishin' in de neighborhood of Armour's Ferry, and Ole Miss 'low how dat was Wheeler's men makin' pursuit. Mars Jeems was wid dem Wheeler fellers, and I knowed ef dey was dat close I wasn't doin' no good settin' round de house toastin' my shins at de fire. So I jest took Mars Jeems's rifle fum behind de door and put out to look after my stock. Seem like I ain't never seen no raw day like that, needer before nor since. There wa'n't no rain, but the wet jest sifted down. Mighty raw day. The leaves on de ground was so wet dey don't make no fuss, and I got in de woods, and whenever I hear de Yankees goin' by, I jest stop in my tracks and let 'em pass. I was standin' that way in de edge of de woods, lookin' out 'cross the clearin' when, piff! Out come a little bunch of blue smoke from de top of one of dem lonesome-lookin' pines, and den pow! Says I to myself, says I, "Honey, you er right on my route, and I'll jest see what kind of bird you got roostin' in you." And whiles I was a lookin' out boost the smoke, piff, and then bang! Wid dat I jest drapped back into de woods, and sorter skeerted round so's to git de tree twixt me and de road. I slid up putty close, and what do you spect I see? Jest as sho as you're settin' there listenin', dey was a live Yankee up there in dat tree, and he was a loadin' and a shootin' at de boys jest as cool as a cowcumber in de dew, and he had his hoss hitch out in de bushes, 'cause I hear de creatur' tromplin' round. He'd a spyglass up dar, and whiles I was a watchin' of him, he raise up and look through her, and den he lay her down and fix his gun fer to shoot. I had good eyes in dem days, ef I ain't got 'em now, and way up the big road I see Mars Jeems a comin'. Hit was too fur fer to see his face, but I knowed him by de filly what I raised fer him, and she was a prancin' like a schoolgal. I knowed dat man was gwineter shoot Mars Jeems ef he could, and dat was more'n I could stand. Many's and many's the time dat I nussed dat boy, and hilt him in dese arms, and toted him on dis back, and when I see dat Yankee lay dat gun cross a limb and take aim at Mars Jeems, I up with my old rifle and shet my eyes and let the man have all she had. "Do you mean to say," exclaimed Miss Theodosia indignantly, "that you shot the Union soldier when you knew he was fighting for your freedom?" "Course I know about all dat," responded Uncle Remus, "and it sorter made cold chills run up my back. But when I see dat man take aim, and Mars Jeems gwine home to Ole Miss and Miss Sally, I jest disremembered all 'bout freedom, and lammed loose. And den after dat, me and Miss Sally tuck and nussed the man right straight along. He lost one arm in dat tree business, but me and Miss Sally we nuss him and we nuss him twel he done got well. Just about dat time I quit nussin' him, but Miss Sally she kep' on. She kep' on," continued Uncle Remus, pointing to Mr. Huntington, "and now dar he is." "But you cost him an arm!" exclaimed Miss Theodosia. "I give him den," said Uncle Remus, pointing to Mrs. Huntington, "and I give him dese," holding up his own brawny arms, "and ef dem ain't enough for any man, den I done lost the way." End of the tale.